Welcome to this new section of the course, HTML forms. And we are going to be looking at what HTML forms are, how do we code HTML forms, and the general, almost everything you need to know about HTML forms. So let's just dive right in. HTML forms is used as a means to collect user data or user input, and you normally use this if you want to process the information or you want to store it. And normally you use some kind of uh, a background server. You want to store the information in a database. You want to give the user some information, some access. So generally, there's so many things. So we use forms in so many diverse ways. So this is an example of a form, right? You're asking for the first name, last name, date of birth, ID, number, and then you submit it. And then you can submit this to a database or whatever, right? So that is a form, and we are going to be looking at everything that has to do with this form. So HTML forms, and first of all, let me first comment this out. Say HTML forms, right? HTML forms uses the form element, and it's this form element, right? This is the element that we use to create HTML forms for user input. And so in this form, we are going to have our form elements, right? I'm just going to put this like this, right? So we're going to, whatever you want the form to have, the inputs that you, and why am I not able to spell element again? Elements, yeah. Okay, so whatever you want the form to have, the inputs and stuff, you define it inside your form elements, and that's what we are about to do. So this form element is more like a container for holding different types of input elements, and some of which we already know, like text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, other buttons for submitting, resetting the form, and all that. So this container, which is going to be the form element, is going to hold all these elements that we are going to be talking about. So the first element that we want to talk about, and it's by far the most common, is known as the input element, right? So it's like this, input. It's known as the input element. And this input element, it's used to generally get inputs from the user, right? And we can have so many types of ways uh, to get this input. We can have the text input, right? So one type is equal to text, right? If you want to display a single line of text, uh, input field, right? It's just a single line of text input from the user. And then we can also have, and maybe let me just copy this. Uh, you can also have a radio, right? If you are looking for kind of a radio button selection for multiple options, right? Or multiple choices. And then we also have this input type called checkbox, right? So you just have to check multiple choices, right? So we have the checkbox, and then we have an input type called submit. And this is more like a button, right? You're trying to create a button that you can click to submit your form, right? So this is the type. And if you just want a button, you can just have, uh, let me put it down here. You can just have an input type called button. And I think we looked at this previously. But yes, so this is some of the input types that we have, right? So I'm gonna just comment all this out for reference. Okay, and then so these are some of the things we're gonna have a quick example uh, with this, right? So let's create our HTML and let's have our doc type, our doc type, and by now you should all know this by heart, HTML, and then we're gonna have our HTML element, and let's just go to the body, and then in the body, let's kind of get a header element in here, and we're gonna call it form with input fields, right? And then let's have our form. So again, we have our form element. This is gonna this is the container for a form element. So our inputs, right? So first of all, let's have every form you need kind of like a label. So there's this element that we just call label. And then in this label, I'm calling it first name, right? And there's this for, and I'm gonna label this F name. Okay. And then I want a break, meaning I want the next element to be on the next line. And I'm gonna have an input, and I'm gonna have a type called text, an ID called F name, and then a name called F name, and the value equal, and this value is what do you want the value of the element to be. So I'm gonna call this Matthew, right? And then I'm gonna break this input off and go to the next line. So you can see here that this label, this for targets, it's a label for the element ID called F name. So you're seeing that put the first name, this label that is first name, right, associated with this input defined as F name. So that's why they have the name. So it matches. So we have our first name. We are gonna do another one for last name, right? So I have another label. I'm gonna have for, and I'm gonna call the next input last L name, right? So I'm gonna call it L name, and then I'm gonna call it last name, right? And then I'm gonna break up the line, and then I have my inputs, which is gonna be my last name. It's gonna be a type text, and it's gonna have an ID equal to L name because that's what we were targeting, right? So I'm gonna target L name, and then it's gonna be called LD, right? So the name value is what this is using. And then let's just say it has an initial value of Matthew Smith, right? And then I close this, and then that ends the form. So, so just so you guys know, the default width of these uh, text inputs that we have here is just 20 characters, right? So just be mindful of that. So if I refresh the page, you have your form with input fields, and then you can see that you have your labels and then your inputs, right? So you can change this, right? And then there you have it. So that's our first form. So a few things to rehash about this, about the label, is that this label that we have here, it defines the label for this element down here, right? And it's not just for inputs, it's used for many elements in a form, right? So you can use a label for most of the input types that we are gonna have, right? And it's helpful because it's useful for screen reader users because the those users will read out this text loud when the user focuses on that input element. So it's very helpful to have those labels in there. It also helps users who have difficulty clicking on very small regions. If you click on the label, it toggles the, if you have a radio button or a checkbox, it's used to toggle that. So that's also useful. And like I said, the four attributes of the label, which is the one that we have here, actually it's used to target the element that we want the label to be used for, which is the element ID. So whatever name you put in the ID is the name that you have to put in there. So let's try and add some radio buttons to this. And I'm just gonna create some space down here. And in here, I'm gonna have, and I need to keep my indentation. Let's create another header, H2, and call this one radio buttons. Radio buttons. Okay. And then I'm gonna say, and let's have a p tag that say choose your favorite food. Okay. And then maybe that, go on. And then I'm gonna have hmm, my sorry. I'm gonna have my input element, and I'm gonna put in there, what type is this? There's gonna be a type of radio, right? And I'm gonna have an ID. I'm gonna call this uh rice, and I'm gonna name this uh favorite favorite underscore food. Okay. And then what value do I need to place in here? I'm gonna call this rice. Okay, so that is our first one. And you can have your label. Sorry, let's create our label. And then I'm gonna put in the label rice. Oh, let's keep all small. And then I'm gonna tag it for which element are we targeting? So we are gonna target the input ID called rice. Okay. And then I wanna break the line off because I want it to go down. And I'm gonna create another input, and maybe I should just copy, and let me copy it because that will be faster. Okay, so I'm gonna copy three of this, and maybe I don't need another break at the last one. And then for this one, I'm gonna name it, uh, what should I call this? Let's say beef, right? I'm gonna call it beef, and I know they don't, but then I'm gonna call this beef. Okay, and then for the third one, I'm gonna call it mashed. Oh no, I'm gonna call it potatoes. Potato, right? And the value and the names don't have and the IDs don't have to be the same. So uh, you can call it differently, right? So I'm just gonna call this potato. Okay, so this will be potato. Okay, great. So now if I refresh this, you have your three uh, input fields, which in this case is radio button. So you can see when you select one, the others go off, right? So that is how we uh, do for radio buttons. One important thing to note about radio buttons is because these are grouped, right? The name here should be the same for all the grouped choices, right? So all these you can see have the name favorite food, favorite food, favorite food because it's in the same group. You just have to select one, right? So that's why we have that. Individual IDs, individual ones can have individual IDs, but the name should be the same, and that's what radio buttons is. So let's now talk about checkboxes. So with radio buttons, you can just select one of a group, but checkboxes allows you to select zero or multiple options of the choices that you have. So we're gonna look at that. So let's try this. I'm also gonna create, and maybe I should have a header, another H2 that just says checkbox, and then have my p tag which says select options or something like that. Okay, and then so let's just have our inputs And the type here is going to be checkbox. Oops, did I forget type? Okay, so the type here is going to be checkbox. ID is going to be equal to a car, right? I'm going to call this name equal to car, and then the value, I'm going to call this, okay, car, right? And then what else do I need here? That's all that I think I need. Yep. So then I now have my label, right? And the label, I'm going to have car, right? But then I have to do the mapping. So I want this to be for which of my elements that I called car, right? So that does it for this one. And then I want to break this line off. So again, it's easier for me to just copy and replicate this maybe two more times. So maybe this icicle will be the bicycle, bicycle, right? And then I'll just copy this, bicycle, bicycle, and this is gonna be for bicycle. Okay, and then finally, maybe let's call this a scooter. Okay, right. I'm gonna call this scooters. Mm, okay, so we have this, right? So if I refresh this, you can see your checkboxes and you can select multiple checkboxes. You can decide not to select anything by default, right? So that is how the select options, the checkbox is. And then I can add a final thing we call the submit, right? So I'm just gonna create another input and the type for this input should be equal to submit and the value I'm gonna say submit. Okay, so then I'm gonna have a button that I can click, right, to submit this form that I have created. So the input type submit, okay, it's what this button does is defines a button for submitting the form data. So whatever data is in the form, right, it submits it to a form handler, which is going to be in the back end your server somewhere, right? Which is going to have a bunch of code for processing your data. Whether you want to store it, you want to process it, you want to show the user something, that handler or that file, that script, uh, it's going to handle whatever inputs that you have put here, and it's going to translate it into something meaningful, right? So the form handler is specified in the form's action attribute, right? So if the form has to have an action attribute which tells the handler what to do. So we are gonna look at that. Okay, so for example, we're not really gonna this is not really gonna do much because we are not handling it, but this form should have an action attribute. And so for example, if you wanted to go to a page on your backend uh, called handle underscore form, maybe if you're using PHP, let's just use this as an example, right? Sorry, handler, right? As an example, it goes to this page, and that page is supposed to handle whatever you have in your form. So because it sent it to that page, right? So that is how it works. Uh, we are not going to talk about any back-end technologies or any of that. We are going to have a separate class for that. So this is just so you know what this means. Again, the inputs, the name of the attribute, so the names that you have here should not be omitted, right? Because uh, when you submit the form, the value of the input field goes with the name, right? So you need to have that always set, right? So you should the input field must have name attribute, right? Before you can submit it. So that is a very important thing to note. So you always have to remember to include that. So thank you for watching this video, this lesson. We are going to look more in forms in the next lesson. Thank you.